Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This talk is called Successful Statistical Strategies for Patient Screening and Stratification. Today's webinar will run for approximately 40 minutes and includes a Q&A session. Cambridge Cognition are a technology company developing digital health products to better understand, detect and treat conditions affecting brain health. Our software products assess cognitive health in patients worldwide to improve clinical trial outcomes, identify and stratify patients early and improve global efficiency in pharmaceutical and healthcare industries. I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Baker, Director of Statistical Sciences at Cambridge Cognition. Working with pharmaceutical, biotechnology and academic clients, Elizabeth develops statistical analysis protocols for the analysis of cognitive endpoints in clinical trials and observational research studies. Since joining Cambridge Cognition in 2017, Elizabeth has supported the development of clinical trial enrichment tools, implemented Bayesian methodologies and conducted statistical analysis across a range of clinical trial designs and CNS disorders. Over to you, Elizabeth.
That's great. Thank you for the kind introduction and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to talk today about statistical planning in studies including cognition as an endpoint, and I'm going to discuss the benefits of particular strategies including pre-screening and patient stratification, and also take a deep dive into a successful pre-screening strategy, namely the incorporation of CANTAB tests and a pre-screening algorithm into the models of patient engagement study, looking to identify, or the goal really was to look to identify undetected cases of mild cognitive impairment or dementia in the general public. So without further ado, I will take that dive into statistical planning. So within any clinical study, whether that be a clinical trial or even an observational study, it's really important that we understand the research question. And that allows us to inform a clear study objective. As you can see, was demonstrated on the image on the right, when we have a clear defined study objective, we can then use this to inform our study design and also the analysis methods that we incorporate. So the objective really should tell us about who we're interested in studying, what is our population of interest, what is the estimate that we want to generate as part of our endpoint, and also what do we need to measure in that particular population. In addition, we also should consider how we are able to generate that estimate, and what is the best study design that allows us to do that and to meet that objective. And then the analysis methods really follow on that in the sense that they allow us to identify how we can generate that estimate of interest, and that allows us to sort of, in generating that estimate, it allows us to question whether we've met our objective or not. Back in 2017, the International Council for Harmonisation released the Estimand framework, and this is really to support the development of the what. What is it in the particular research, in the particular study that we want to estimate, and what are the important factors that we need to consider as part of that construction of that estimate. So the framework is primarily focused on confirmatory trials, but I think it has useful uses outside of trials as confirmatory trials in observational studies as well. And it really focuses on considering the population, the variable of interest, kind of intercurrent events that might mitigate or might impact the interpretation of the endpoints, and also a kind of deriving a summary measure that allows us to inform whether we've met that objective or not. And so this really is about constructing estimands that help us to define the estimate to address that research question. So that kind of gives you a framework for understanding how to create the objective and what are the important contributions that we need to consider in order to construct that objective, and then that guides that analysis method that we can use in order to generate the summary measures or the estimates that we want to understand whether we've met that study objective. So what does this look like in practice? And what does that look like for cognitive endpoints or studies including cognitive endpoints? So let's take a look at the Ebbinghaus study. So the Ebbinghaus study is a part of a much larger trial to assess the impact of PCSK9 inhibitors on risk of cardiovascular events. So it's part of the FOURIER trial, which was run by Amgen and TIMI. And it's designed to really answer that question of, were these PCSK9 inhibitors associated with cognitive deficits? And in the lead up to this study, there was increasing evidence that these kind of inhibitors may actually negatively impact cognition. And so this trial was really answering that question of, was there an association with these particular inhibitors and this novel therapy with cognitive deficits? So with that in mind, the objective was constructed to understand whether the new therapy, whether cognition and particularly executive function, was performing no worse in those on the control therapy. So, which was in this case, which is statin therapy. So whether individuals received the new therapy showed any elevated impairment relative to kind of the current standard of care. And this allowed the estimate to be derived as a non-inferiority margin. And in this case, there was a treatment difference of less than 20% of the observed standard deviation within the change in the placebo group. And using this estimate, it was then possible to generate a sample size calculation to inform the size of the population needed to address this question. And then the analysis methods followed on from that, in that in order to generate that mean change over time, we can use things like mixed effects models for repeated measures to estimate that change over time, but also look at the interaction with the two treatment groups, so the new novel therapy and the current standard of care, to investigate whether there was that difference observed in that mean change from baseline. And then that allowed the calculation of the effect size to then re-evaluate whether the objectives of the study had been met. So that gives you a kind of overview of the different aspects to consider when linking your objective to your analysis methods. But it's also when thinking about constructing your objective, it's also important to consider sources of variability that might impact success in meeting your trial objective. And making sure that the appropriate methods allow you to minimise that variance in order to give the best opportunity to meet that trial objective. So thinking about that reduction or minimisation of variance within your study, there are two particular themes sort of on this front, and that is understanding the variability in your population and also understanding taking a considered approach to endpoint selection. So when it comes to kind of endpoint selection, we want to be choosing objective measures that allow that unbiased assessment of cognition. And in the Ebbinghaus trial, the inclusion of the spatial working memory task, the strategy score, was chosen as the objective measure of executive function. And alongside looking at objective measures, we also want to look at measures that have that consistent method of delivery. And that enables the reduction of measurement variability to kind of minimise that variability from rater to rater. So as part of understanding the variability in the population of interest, so there are kind of two strategies that we can use, and I've listed them here, so pre-screening and patient stratification. So let's just start talking about patient stratification. Okay, so in patient stratification, we're using a set criteria to group individuals by similar characteristics. And this is often used when there's considerable heterogeneity in a population that occurs as a result of a known factor. And also that this factor is thought to be in some way prognostic, so influencing the outcome and potentially the response to treatment when it comes to clinical trials. And a couple of examples of this are kind of multi-centre trials, where we might perform stratified randomisation by the centre and balance recruitment across those centres and group those individuals more to balance individuals across those centres, and then perform a stratified analysis by centre as part of the overall analysis. And that allows us to group individuals with more similar variability and account for that variability as we're estimating any kind of treatment effects as part of the trial. And a second example of this is within the Ebbinghaus trial. So within obviously one of the key risk factors in cardiovascular events is that initial level of cholesterol. That has a really important impact on the risk for cardiovascular events. So in assessing cognitive health, it's really important to control for that risk factor across treatment arms to ensure that we're seeing we're not seeing kind of we're not seeing an unexplained kind of increase in safety endpoints within one particular arm or another. We've got that balance of risk, so we can control for that variability and that understanding within our study. And so stratified randomization was used by that baseline cholesterol level to ensure that we understood the real impact of LDL as a risk factor within safety endpoints for the trial. So there are also other areas in which stratification is becoming more of an there's more of an interest in performing patient stratification. So increasingly in cognitive impairment in schizophrenia, there is awareness of that heterogeneity in cognitive impairment across individuals with the disorder. And actually more recently, there's been some research that has suggested that by performing a stratified analysis, there's been a cognitive improvement observed in those that have shown the highest level of impairment. So that suggests, or is starting to suggest, that actually the level of impairment that somebody has when they enter a trial is actually really informative how they're going to respond to that therapy that is targeting cognition. So actually that suggests that maybe to kind of elucidate and understand that further, we should be looking at stratification as a route for our schizophrenia trials to increase the power to detect those the effect or a therapy effect in those most likely to observe that effect. And there's a lot of evidence still going on to accumulate and understand this further, but it does suggest as a route for really understanding whether stratified randomization could help us support whether this effect is a really true and meaningful effect for schizophrenia patients. So I've given an overview really of patient stratification, where we're kind of grouping individuals by preset criteria. In pre-screening, we're doing something fairly similar in the sense that we are providing a criteria, setting of criteria to identify individuals to progress into a study. But actually what we're doing, instead of grouping individuals by similar characteristics, we're saying actually these are the particular individuals that we'll take forward through to the trial as they have the particular characteristics that we're interested in. So we know that screening is an essential part of any study to ensure we recruit the appropriate individuals into our study. But pre-screening involves recruiting individuals to take an assessment prior to screening, so to help understand whether they could meet the requirements for the target population before they undergo a much lengthier and costlier screening examination. Any individuals then not meeting that criteria are then excluded, and actually this reduces the number of screen fails at the screening assessment. By doing this, we identify and enrich the screening sample for individuals who meet that screening criteria. But it also has the benefit of aligning the level of impairment or the degree of impairment across the sample. And that has the impact of reducing again, reducing variability that could be impacting response to therapy, and particularly for disorders like Alzheimer's disease, where we know there's a heterogeneity in performance across the disease, and it can be really important to identify particular individuals at a particular stage of disease in order to understand the effect of treatment. Another benefit to using pre-screening methods is that when it's partnered with a web-based testing or home testing, this has the potential to have a much wider reach of participants from more diverse backgrounds, particularly when partnered with advertising campaigns. And actually on this front, we've seen excellent engagement in web platforms by individuals at risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. And we've seen this in models of patient engagement study, the Healthy Brain Project, and in the Brain Health Registry as well. So let's take a bit of a deeper dive and into a particular example where pre-screening has supported a clinical study. And in this case, we're going to look at the pre-screening strategy to identify those at risk of dementia and mild cognitive impairment. So the goal of the models of patient engagement study was to really evaluate different strategies and different methods to ultimately identify undetected cases in the general population of dementia, and also increase the awareness of dementia as well. And this kind of pan-European project involved clinical sites and web platforms in Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, Slovenia, and Sweden. And the objective was to assess these different approaches. And there are 4 particular strategies that we used. So firstly, we had the web-based pre-screening strategy, where an online marketing campaign targeted individuals to a web platform. And this was created to give information around dementia and Alzheimer's disease, but also individuals could sign up to complete or volunteer to complete CANTAB assessments and be provided with further information on their performance. The Open House initiative really looked to open up the opportunity for people to have their memory assessed. So it took away the requirement of a doctor or a doctor's referral in order to visit a memory clinic, allowing people with concern of their memory to go along to receive an evaluation. And then the other 2 strategies were more focused around current care, so using kind of current primary care practice and incorporating additional screening at a kind of regular visit that a patient might be attending, and giving the opportunity to take an additional screening assessment. And that was the same with Run 4, but within a kind of diabetes clinics, the participants were given the opportunity to take an additional screening, making use of the fact that we know there's an elevated risk of impairment in individuals with diabetes. So I'm going to talk more specifically about the web-based screening tool through the next slides, and the impact that had on identification of patients with MCI and dementia. So what did the pre-screening tool look like? To be eligible for inclusion, individuals had to be over the age of 65 and without a previous diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's disease, and also were willing to share their demographic information, performing 2 tests, and a test of episodic memory and a test of working memory, being our paired associates learning task and our spatial working memory task. Within the tool, these participant scores, adjusted for age and gender, were then reviewed by an algorithm to determine whether they met the criteria for impairment, which could be a risk of an underlying disorder, or in fact whether they were kind of worried well and were not showing signs of risk of impairment. And what we found is that overall, about 3.8% of people reaching that web tool were willing to be involved in the study. So they were willing to take the Cantab tests and also provide that demographic information to allow them to undergo a screening assessment. On interim review of these results, we found that on average about 35% of individuals were showing a risk of cognitive impairment. And actually that did vary by country in alignment with the kind of uptake, the differences in uptake across those different countries as well. And that really reflected their different advertising and marketing campaigns. So on close of the study, the kind of different methods were evaluated, and individuals who had entered the study were given the opportunity to be contacted to undergo further follow-up. And actually 42% of individuals that met that criteria went on for further diagnostic evaluation. And of those, 54% were diagnosed with MCI or dementia. An important measure for evaluation of this is the positive predicted value. And at the end of the study, the estimate for this was 53.8%. And we saw this vary, again, as I suggested, by country. And those countries with the highest engagement show the highest positive predicted value. And what's really interesting is that the odds of impairment compared to the hope analysis were actually comparable. And so that's important because what we're seeing with a web-based tool, we're seeing what we expect to be a much lower prevalence of dementia because we're targeting a much broader sample of individuals, and also that may well be of a healthier age range and disposition. And so seeing that kind of level of odds of risk of impairment actually shows the benefit of enriching the sample that the individuals that were willing to be diagnosed or undergo further evaluation. It shows the effectiveness of that in identifying those individuals that were most at risk. Importantly, also, this is the only strategy that didn't include a kind of a clinical severity scale as well. So these were a kind of objective measures of cognition in identifying risk for MCI dementia. So this, you can imagine in a kind of clinical trial framework, this shows us that we have the ability to increase confidence in those identified through this process that would be included within a screen, would be included within an Alzheimer's trial, and actually enrich that sample, so reducing the opportunity for screen failure at screening assessment. So hopefully that's given you an overview of the processes that assessment and the pre-selection that can be provided through a statistical strategy, and then also show the effectiveness of that within a clinical study. So throughout this presentation, I hope that I've shown you the considerations that need to be made in informing statistical analysis methods, and also I've shown you the different approaches that can be used to increase study success through patient stratification and pre-screening. And I've also shown you how a statistical algorithm can support pre-screening to support the enrichment of the target population for a clinical study.
Great, thank you very much for that, Elizabeth. Thank you for that great talk. So we've had a few questions come in. The first question is, for an observational study, how do you construct a target value for an estimate without previous evidence in the research field and use this to inform sample size calculation?
So that's a really good question and can be challenging when there isn't necessarily a kind of example study to base your calculations on. But I think what's really important is in defining your target value for an estimate is your assumptions. So even when we have previous literature out there that supports a particular effect size, we're still making assumptions about what we're expecting to see and the population, but also what is meaningful. So I think in the context of a new disease area, I think it's really important to lay out those assumptions really clearly, and consider what is really the most important thing that you want to investigate. So is there an effect size or that's been seen in a similar approach, or something that would guide you in forming an assumption around what that estimate could be?
Thank you. The next question is, do you have any guidance on including normative data to support pre-screening inclusion criteria?
So yeah, normative data can be really informative to support pre-screening. Where I think it's really important when you're thinking about using normative data is who are you really trying to target? Are you trying to target individuals without impairment, or whether you're trying to identify people with impairment, and setting a threshold kind of appropriately based on that?
Okay, thank you. The next question, during pre-screening, how do you decide if one individual is showing the risk of cognitive impairment or not? Is there a score threshold, for example, for PAL?
So I think sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. During pre-screening, how do you decide if one individual is showing the risk of cognitive impairment or not? Is there a score threshold, for example, for PAL?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think this goes back to the normative performance question, actually. So it's really important to consider, again, the population, who you're trying to include to set that threshold. Are you looking, again, at performance on PAL? There's a range of performance, are we looking to identify individuals with impairment? And also it's also in the population that you're looking at, what is the expected rate of identifying those participants, in terms of, if you target that particular population, what proportion of people do you think will meet that particular threshold of impairment?
Okay, great, thank you. And the last question, you mentioned that by partnering with remote assessment, pre-screening has the potential to increase diversity in the study. How do you overcome access to technology?
I think overcoming access to technology and actually just considering potential barriers more broadly is really important. I think we've seen within a kind of an older adult population, such as we've seen in the MOPIAD study, actually we've seen really good engagement. So I think it's about matching the population that you're interested in with the kind of the devices and the tools that allow you to target that population. There's always going to be challenges in uptake, but I think it's really important just to consider the best technology, but also the other barriers that might be restricting engagement, such as kind of local privacy information, and also the method of directing individuals. What are the kind of avenues, what are the marketing strategies that would support you overcoming that technology barrier?
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you for a really great talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time today.